Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. As people start to trickle in, we're going to play ULI Toronto's new prop tech series trailer.
Having tools that allow you to better understand your operations and make more data-driven decisions will give companies an edge.
If you want to make a bigger impact, then we're going to go and understand people's behavior.
If the tool works and it enables you to do your job more efficiently, it will get adopted.
With so many people being inundated by technology and information, what wave do you jump on?
I think it's really important that we, as an industry, open up and be much more collaborative about the solutions that we apply.
Now is the time to create better, build better, and be better.
Great. My name is Sean Blake, representative at Carpenters District Council of Ontario and a member of ULI Toronto's advisory board. I'm excited to welcome you to today's webinar, Colonialism, Enslavement, and Abolition in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. Today's event is to explore the region's history of colonialism, enslavement, and abolition, and the displacement of Black people in the name of progress. This history has shaped the region and the communities we know today. For all of those who do not know, August 1st is now federally known as Emancipation Day, and the City of Toronto recognized the month of August as Emancipation Month. On August 1st, 1834, an act came into effect that ended slavery in the former British colonies, including Upper and Lower Canada. The act freed about 800,000 enslaved people of African descent across colonies nearly 200 years ago. Before we get started, go through the land acknowledgement. As a Toronto region-based organization, we acknowledge the land we are meeting on today, virtually, is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, and newcomers in this generation or generations past. ULI Toronto stands in solidarity with Indigenous communities demanding action and accountability for the ongoing legacy of the residential school system. We'd like to also acknowledge and honor those who came here involuntarily, particularly those who are descended from those brought here through enslavement. To better understand the meaning behind this land acknowledgement, we recommend 3 programs that we have uploaded to YouTube. These links are available in the chat. They are 13,000 Years of Indigenous History in the GTA and Why It Matters to Planning and Development, and more recently, Whose Land and Whose Law? And finally, Indigenous Toronto, the stories our city paved over. Before we start the slide, a few housekeeping items before we begin. Everyone will automatically be muted throughout the session to avoid audio interference. Closed captioning is available for this session. You can access it via the button along the bottom of the Zoom platform. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function or upvote questions by pressing the thumbs up button. This is a recorded session. The recording will be sent to you after the session. If you want to take the conversation online, please tag us with the handle @ULI Toronto or with the hashtag AskGreatQuestions. Today's event and all other ULI programming would not be possible without the support of our annual sponsors. I would like to say a major thank you to all of them for their support. with a specific acknowledgement today of our diamond sponsor on diversity, equity, and inclusion, Alice Dawn. Now, more than ever, ULI Toronto relies on the support of our sponsors who have allowed us to put on the programming, quality programming we do and do drive our mission to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact in communities worldwide. To all of them, we say thank you. Additionally, special shout out and thank you to my organization, Carpenters District Council of Ontario, who as of August 12th of this year, 2021, is now a 140-year-old organization. And we pride ourselves in supplying the industry, construction industry, with the next generation of skilled workers, carpenters. It is my pleasure to introduce today's overview presentator, Natasha Henry. Natasha Henry is an award-winning author and an award-winning curriculum developer, focusing on Black Canadian experiences. She is a historian and has been an educator for 22 years. Natasha is the current president of the Ontario Black History Society. Natasha is an experienced curriculum consultant focused on developing resources on the African diasporic experience. She has developed the educational resources for several exhibits and web-based projects on the Black experience in Canada, including the CBC miniseries, The Book of Negroes. Her 2016 master's major research project, Lend Me Your Ear, the voice of early African Canadian communities in Ontario through petitions, investigated the current state of the teaching of African Canadian history in elementary and secondary public schools. Natasha's MRP includes a curriculum unit developed around 6 petitions, penned by individuals and groups of African Canadians, with the intent of bringing the voices, opinions, and experiences of African Canadians into classrooms as a way to model how the African Canadian counter-narrative can be incorporated within the existing curricular framework. Natasha is currently completing a PhD in history at York University, researching the enslavement of Africans in early Ontario. She received a Vanier Scholarship in 2018 to support her academic research. Through her various professional and community roles, Natasha's work is grounded in her dedication to research, collect, preserve, and disseminate the histories of African Canadians. We have posted her full bio in the chat. With that, I'll pass it over to you, Natasha.
Well, thank you so much, Sean. Good afternoon to you, and good afternoon to everyone in attendance today for this conversation, which I have been looking forward to. So I'm going to open up this conversation by talking about the history of enslavement and abolition here in not only in the Greater Horseshoe area, but also in Canada as well. And as Sean had talked about in the land acknowledgement and the acknowledgement of African ancestors, that it's important for us to really think about the complexities of colonialism, recognizing that Black people through the history of enslavement and colonization are stolen people here on stolen land. Today, I'm going to give a bit of background on the history of enslavement in Canada, which is part of colonization. I will also discuss emancipation. And as Sean has mentioned, Emancipation Day this year, we marked 187 years of Emancipation Day commemorations, and that is here in Canada as well, since 1834. But this year is the first, I'm hesitating to say the word official because Black people have been celebrating for almost 200 years, but it's the first time that it is recognized across Canada through the federal government, which is good to see. And so I will also, in my talk and through our panel conversation, we will talk about the legacies of slavery today. So enslavement as an institution, as part of French and British colonization, was introduced in the 1600s by the French and was a practice for over 200 years, from the 1620s to 1834, which we just talked about as being Emancipation Day. The first person who was documented as being enslaved, an African person, was a young boy who was given the name of Olivier Lejeune, and his sale was documented in 1628 in Quebec. The introduction of enslavement of indigenous and African peoples began from east to west, from the maritime provinces through to Quebec, and then into Ontario. Louisbourg, which was a part of Ile Royale under the French, which is now Cape Breton, and Prince Edward Island were some of the earliest documentations of those who were enslaved. This area then became permanent settlement, at first temporary because of fishing. And should note that fishing of codfish, for example, supplied the Caribbean market, the slave markets in the Caribbean to feed those who were enslaved there. Here in Louisbourg, there was a young woman by the name of Marie Marguerite who was enslaved there for 19 years. She was released, she emancipated in 1755, and she became a free woman. And so in her life and freedom, she married a Mi'kmaq man and named James Baptiste Laurent, and they ran an inn and a tavern. And so she was one of the earliest known recorded Black businesswomen in Canadian history, as we see the plaque here recognizing her as a person of national historic significance. In Quebec as well, as I mentioned, was one of the earlier places of enslavement as well. And we see here that during this time and under the French, about 2/3 of those who were held in bondage were Indigenous, while about 1/3 were those who were African descent. And this was true up until 1760. So enslavement became a common practice as part of colonization. One of the known stories is that of Marie-Joseph Angelique through the exceptional research of Dr. Afua Cooper in her book, The Hanging of Angelique, where she was she's alleged to have started a fire that resulted in the burning of a large portion of Montreal after she attempted to escape because she learned that her mistress was going to sell her off. And so she was captured. She was subsequently tortured and forced to confess, and which she did. She was found guilty, and she was then hung and burned at the stake in 1734 in downtown Montreal. Her story is one that, is another one of those that's recorded that again speaks to the ways that enslavement was upheld and accepted through the courts that tried her. We also, through her story, see the very many ways that enslaved Africans resisted their enslavement. And then here is a portrait of a Haitian woman. The title has changed over the years, but this image was of a woman enslaved in Montreal after being forcefully relocated by her enslavers from Haiti. And so this is another way that we see the enslavement of African people documented through in historical archives. In 1763, between 1760 and 1763, following the end of the 7 Years' War between the French and the British, this time period saw the French concede and the British gain colonial control of, what was then Canada at that time, what would become Canada. And as part of this exchange of colonial powers, one of the things that remained consistent was the acceptance and the enforcement of slavery by Imperial Act. It was subsequently endorsed by statute and through private law as well. Here we see, as part of the Treaty of Surrender in Montreal in 1760, Article 47 stipulates that Black people and Indigenous people who were held as slaves will remain as such after the British transition. Then we have here in the British, under British control, what we start to see is that those who were held in bondage became exclusively African people, which was, as a result of the British and following what was happening in other parts of the Americas under British control. Through private law, people who were enslaved were bought and sold, bequeathed to family members. Again, as I mentioned, through private law. Here's an example of a bill of sale. We see here of a Negro woman and child. The woman's name was Bet, the child's name is unknown. And in 1812, she is sold from Joseph Keeler, a loyalist, to another loyalist by the name of William Walbridge. And this is in 1812 in the Kingston, Belleville area. Enslavement was, through its 200-year history, was hereditary. And so the children that was born to enslaved women were born into enslavement, even if their father, Black or potentially white, were free people. And then when the British wanted to encourage further settlement of British North America following the American Revolution and the British laws, they instituted an Imperial Act that encouraged those potential immigrants, white immigrants, to import the people that they enslaved, their chattel or private property, duty-free for a period of 1 year. This is 1790, the 1790 Imperial Act. In 1793, John Graves Simcoe, the lieutenant governor, and the Attorney General John White attempted to introduce legislation to abolish slavery here in Upper Canada, which is now Ontario. And they used an incident of Chloe Cooley, a Black woman in the Niagara on the Lake area, who was bound and sold across the Niagara River. They used that incident to try to introduce this legislation to abolish slavery. However, they received a lot of opposition because about half of the politicians, the founding politicians of this province, themselves enslaved Black men, women, and children. And so the compromise was a bill that would gradually abolish slavery over about 3 generations going into the 1830s. And this is the picture of that legislation here. And an interesting connection here is that Simcoe reports to his superior, Henry Dundas, mentioning briefly about the opposition of politicians and that, slavery would be gradually abolished over time. Upheld through private law, as I mentioned, enslaved people were passed on to family members. Fathers passed on the property that they held in slaves to their wives and to their children, understanding that this would benefit them and grow their personal wealth, but also grew the wealth of the colonies as well. This will is interesting for a number of reasons. If you notice that I pointed out the legislation of 1793, it's often touted as the first anti-slavery legislation. Some people misconstrue it and misrepresent it as being the first legislation in British colonies to abolish slavery. It did not. The very first thing it did is confirmed slavery. It provided as a statute that legal grounds to support and reinforce the practice. That was the very first thing it did. And it represented the pro-slavery beliefs of politicians and the elites and a lot of the white settlers of the colony. If you look at this, at this will, this excerpt, this will was written by a loyalist, James Gertie, in Essex County. And it was written in 1804, and it was probated in 1817. So look at how many years after 1793, after everyone was aware that there's this effort to gradually abolish slavery. What we see here is that Mr. Gertie, like many others, had hoped to hold on to their slave property as long as possible and to ensure that their family benefited as long as possible. He bequeathed to his son James 6 Negro slaves, Jim, Hannah, Joe, Jack, Betsy, and Tom, and they bequeathed the children which may hereafter be born to said Hannah and Betsy. And so we see here again that there is this insistence of carrying on the institution through the birth of potential children. Other documentation that gives us a little bit more information of those who were enslaved and the people that enslaved them were runaway advertisements, as well as advertisements that placed slaves for sale. Here is an advertisement, runaway ad of Bet, and if you recall the bill of sale of Bet in 1812, by 1818 she had been sold to Roswell Levins in Belleville, and she had fled September 28th with a young child. And this advertisement ran for 3 consecutive issues of the newspaper. And so here again, we get an instance, we get to see through Bet's story, which I wrote a chapter in an upcoming book, of her experience being enslaved as a woman, as a mother, and also seeing how she was sold from, from one loyalist to the next, one settler to the next. Again, something looking at the ways that that was common. It's important to also understand that Canada was, what we now call Canada, those colonies were part of the wider phenomenon of transatlantic slavery in different ways, as I talked about there, whether it was the importation of people who were enslaved, exporting different products such as salted codfish to Southern Americas. There were also 19 slave ships that were built in the Maritimes for British merchants to transport African captives from the continent of Africa to the Americas. So this is another way that Canada was very much entangled in the transatlantic slave trade. There was an estimated 4,500 Black people who were enslaved in Canada during the 206 years of its practice, of which approximately 500 of those were enslaved in Ontario. What we can see here is that enslavement was built into the structuring of the ideologies and the social, legal, economic, and political infrastructure of the colonies that became Canada. Enslaved people were used for their labor, exploited for their labor to help, as I mentioned, build personal wealth, but also to grow the colonies. Enslaved men cleared land, they chopped wood, they built structures like homes and barns on the land grants of Indigenous land that was bestowed to loyalists by the British government. Enslaved men and women labored as agricultural workers on homesteads, preparing fields for planting, harvesting crops, and tending to livestock in smaller kitchen gardens. Enslaved people also labored for extensive, arduous hours and were always at the beck and call of their enslavers. Here in Canada, we don't have common relics of architecture of enslavement like plantations in the United States and the Caribbean, but they do exist in different forms. And the enslaved have effectively been erased from the built environment that we have come to know. But there is a lot of material culture that we can look at and think critically about what this means for our work in our respective roles. This is an exact picture of an archaeological dig taking place. And I wanted to raise the question around, in these endeavors of these archaeological digs, is there any consideration for a Black presence, Black settlers, whether they were enslaved or free? And some of these, the evaluations of the material cultures that are found, have even just for example, more recently, more systematically acknowledge Indigenous histories and presence. But it's, as it relates to Black history and Black presence, that's something that is a new goal for some of these endeavors. So a couple of examples as it relates to the built environment and material culture connected to enslavement in Canada. These are images of Matthew Elliott's plantation in Amherstburg, just outside of Windsor. And he is known to have enslaved between 50 to 60 Black people. And there are noted slave quarters that were actually noted in earlier archaeological studies as well. Eliot commissioned the building of an estate that modeled after a Southern style plantation. His original home was a two-story stone house, and it was likely built by those who he enslaved. Many of these people, men and women, would flee to Detroit in 1806, 1807, and 1808 in pursuit of their freedom. He was known to be a cruel person, and you'll see this ring here. It's called part of a whipping post, where it was noted that that was where he inflicted punishment on those who he enslaved. And he was also a known slave trader. There's several communications of people such as Peter Russell in downtown Toronto wanting to use him as a broker for the sale of a mother and child. Here is what was Toronto's first jail, which is now at the location of the King Edward's Hotel. And in this jail, there were people who were enslaved, who were jailed there as part of their punishment. And in one instance, William Jarvis, the first provincial secretary, used this jail to jail a couple of the people that he enslaved, a young boy, and a young woman. The young boy, Prince, because he and another woman attempted to run away to get married and to live in freedom, and a young woman by the name of Kitty, who was jailed. And Kitty, in the court records, notes that she preferred to remain in jail, knowing that her punishment was to be whipped rather than to be returned to the Jarvis household. So that just, is just a slight indication of the circumstances that she may have faced. William Jarvis and his wife Hannah enslaved 6 people, 3 men and 3 women, right at the corner of Sherbourne and Adelaide. In New Brunswick, there is other documentation of related properties to enslavement. This home, built and owned by Jonathan Odell. He was a politician in New Brunswick and provincial secretary for that province for a number of years. He enslaved a number of people. Harvey Amani Whitfield had done quite a bit of research there. And here again is noted, similar to Jarvis too, that there was at one time evidence of what people call slave quarters, where the enslaved lived. And on these properties where there were orchards and farms, they engaged in a lot of work, all kinds of work. Joseph Brandt, Mohawk chief, is also known to have enslaved upwards of 40 Black people. He was a loyalist ally, and he raised in English schooling, and so had close ties with British colonial officials and government leaders. He, as I mentioned, enslaved about 40 people in Burlington, which is something that is interesting. And one of them that he enslaved was a young girl by the name of Sophia Pooley, and we learned about her story directly through her voice, through an interview. What is interesting to note, and in many of these people noted as founders, that there is no mention of them being enslavers in the heritage plaques that commemorate them or in the biographies. And so it's important to think about and make that connection to the colonial legacies of enslavement. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about the, the renaming of Dundas Street because of his role in prolonging the enslavement in British colonies. And as I mentioned, he was a superior to John Graves Simcoe, who reported to him. We continue to grapple with these colonial legacies, and we need to do so because this history over time and the built environment, urban expansion, these histories become erased, sometimes unintentionally and very much so intentionally as well. Last summer, there was several guerrilla signs that were placed intended to disrupt what I just talked about, this erasure of the history of slavery, noting the names of streets named after people who enslaved Black and Indigenous people. So there were 3 plaques here: the Babé family, known to have enslaved a number of people in Windsor and Detroit, Jarvis Street, as I mentioned, and Russell Hill, named after Peter Russell, who I mentioned was the first administrator of the province and enslaved a family of 4. And then in 1833, legislation was introduced to abolish slavery, and that came into effect August 1st, 1834, and that is known as Emancipation Day. And this across the British colonies, including Canada, became an immediate day of celebration. And there are at least a handful of people who were enslaved in Ontario at that time. Emancipation Day became, as I said, an instant day of celebration, organized by Black people for Black people across Canada, as you can see here. And the occasion was marked with church services, speakers, local speakers invited from the United States and even in other parts from the other parts of the world. Here we have Dr. King as a speaker in the 1950s at the Windsor Emancipation Day event. Another key feature of Emancipation Day were parades, people marching with floats, banners, horse-drawn carriages. At the very back of this image, you'll see in white women being drawn on a carriage. And this is an important representation of Black people marching in celebration, but we also know the importance and the connection to marching in the streets as part of protest. And protest was a consistent theme of Emancipation Day celebrations as commemorations as well. This is a sketch of a parade in London, Ontario in 1896. And here is a group of young girls marching in the parade in Windsor. Of a quick note, Caravana, introduced here in Toronto in 1967, is an embodiment of the celebration of freedom by newly emancipated people in the Caribbean. And they brought this way of marking Emancipation Day through Carnival as part of Caravana, which is always marked at that weekend. The end of enslavement did not mean that the views of Black people changed over time. It did not end the views that white settlers held of Black people of being inferior, deficit, the racist views of white people Black people that were held by many white Canadians. And so what we start to see immediately after emancipation is exclusion of Black people from Canadian society through segregation. This is a map of a school district just 6 years after emancipation here in Ontario in Essex County, where schools were segregated. This is, we continue to deal with that legacy today. We also see the exclusion and segregation of Black people in residential spaces. Here is a clause, a restrictive covenant clause from a cottage project in Sarnia in 1946, effectively barring a number of people, non-white people or non-European from particular places, from this property, this community, unless they were employees and accompanied by white owners of these properties. This was a common feature of, of land ownership. And so when we think about space and where Black people are and are not, we see that there is, some very real implications in history as it relates to that. We also see through, our own civil rights movement, where Black Canadians were challenging their exclusion in different spaces, private and public, here in 1950s, the advocacy pushing against the racial exclusion in Ontario, particularly Dresden, Ontario. And this multiracial effort resulted in the first legislation against racial discrimination, which was subsequently rolled into the human rights legislation, the Human Rights Code that was introduced in 1962. Here is a placard from an Emancipation Day celebration, a parade in Toronto in the 1950s. We often look at the United States and think that, the civil rights movement was just relegated there, but this was a reminder that Canada has its own history to grapple with. During the pandemic last year, 2020 Emancipation Day continued. Just as an example, to show how important it was and how connected it was to the wider push and agitation for Black life during the uprisings of last spring, going into the summer. And just a quick note to say that I've written about the history of Emancipation Day and connected it to the Black communities that have developed in Canada over time. Looking at these legacies, we see the ongoing realities of the legacies of enslavement and how they've impacted Black people in different spheres of life, the ways that Black people have continue to deal with these impacts, and as it relates to space. Emancipation Day, as I said, is very much connected into that. And the roots of Emancipation Day and the movement for Black lives is a struggle for freedom and full citizenship. And Black Canadians continue to face systemic racial inequalities that are entrenched in this history. We see this playing out in the revisiting of history, this importance of having this conversation and the relationship between Black people and space, how Black people are treated, how they have taken up space in the streets and in other spaces, how Black people continue to have to navigate space from enslavement through to today. Understanding this complex history can help us to become better practitioners and to think critically about public remembering and the built environment that we have to contend with as part of our roles. And so I hope my talk gave you a little bit of insight in terms of that continuity and change and evolution of enslavement, of emancipation, of freedom, and that ongoing pursuit of freedom, and what that can and should mean for Black people as they continue in that endeavor. Thank you.
Natasha, thank you for the informative presentation.
You're welcome.
This foundational knowledge will help us unpack, explore, and understand the colonial history of our region and how it has formed our region and communities. To further our discussion, we are going to shift to our panel discussion. I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator today, Robert Walter Joseph. Robert Walter Joseph is an urban planning consultant working in the Greater Toronto area. He is currently a planner at Gladkey Planning Associate and works in the area of land use and development approvals to guide clients towards the development of residential, commercial, and employment lands throughout the Greater Toronto region. In addition to Natasha, we are also joined by Deirdre McCorkindale on our panel. Deirdre McCorkindale is a PhD candidate in history at Queen's University and a member of the Chatham Kent Black Historical Society. Her area of study is the history of race in North America, specializing in African American and African Canadian history. Her current research concerns the nature of education and intelligence testing in Southwestern Ontario. Their bios will be posted into the chat box. I will now pass it over to Robert for the panel discussion. Over to you, Robert.
Thanks, Sean. Natasha, I just want to thank you for that presentation. It was a really remarkable sort of presentation and an overview of the history of enslavement and emancipation in Canada. And Deirdre, also thank you for joining us. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you both today. And you know, going to try and cover quite a lot. We don't have that much time to get over everything that I'd like to get into, but I mean, I think there's some things that as a community of planners and developers and real estate professionals, there are really some things that that you've presented to us that we really can learn from. So Natasha, maybe I'll start with you. I just want to, you know, when Canadians think of the history of slavery, we can often sort of focus on our role as a destination through the Underground Railroad. But, you know, obviously, as you've presented, Canada has its own history with enslavement, with other loyalist arrivals, with other, you know, runaway slaves as well. Can you tell us about the significance of emancipation itself to Canada and to Black communities in Canada?
Sure. So as I mentioned, there would have been, you know, at least a handful of children turning into adults who would have been freed at that time in the early 1830s. And there was one example of a young boy who was his remaining 10 years were sold in 1824. In the summer of 1824, that would have brought him to 1834 when the act took effect. What it also did, the 1793 Act to limit slavery, as well as this legislation, was then it also created the idea of Canada as a place of freedom. And so we start to see numbers of freedom seekers from the United States coming into Canada and different parts in Canada, but the heaviest concentration in Ontario, and start to see the establishment of communities of freedom seekers across Southwestern Ontario. And Deidre may talk a little bit about Chatham, but we see that as one example where Black people are coming. There are some planned communities for freedom seekers. In other places, you know, communities formed, neighborhoods in urban areas, and people came together, raised families, they established community institutions, they agitated continuously for full freedom and their rights that were guaranteed to them as British subjects and later Canadian citizens, such as, you know, some of the things I had mentioned there. But these communities, they grew, they were thriving communities, and then they were also agitating for freedom, and they celebrated Emancipation Days. A lot of these communities where we see the celebration of August 1st, but also using it as a way to advocate for the end of slavery in the United States. So we have to see this, the push for freedom and emancipation as connected across the Americas by Black people. And we see that in the communities, the Black communities past and present, that movement of Black people, force and through choice later on in the Black communities in Canada.
So Deirdre, on top of your work as an academic, you are also from the community of Chatham. Yes. As well. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the history of the Black community in Chatham and Kent County, you know, looking to pre-emancipation and as well the history of the community after.
Sure. So Natasha's presentation actually works perfectly when we're talking about the history of Chatham, because Chatham itself and Kent County, it's referred to, the municipality as of the 1990s is Chatham, Kent. So that includes Dresden, that includes other areas of Black settlement, not just Chatham. But that area is so often seen as, you know, the gold standard for Underground Railroad communities, this story of freedom. But the history of Chatham is very, very much engulfed in the history that Natasha was talking about throughout her presentation, because now, unfortunately, I don't specifically study the history of enslavement in the area, but we don't know very much about him, but one of the very first Black settlers that we have record of in the Chatham area was an enslaved man by the name of Frank. Unfortunately, we don't have the last name. He was enslaved by an Indigenous woman by the name of Sally Ennis. And so they would have been here in the late 1700s. So while Chatham has this history of the Underground Railroad, abolitionism, activism, it's very important to remember that the foundations here are also foundations in colonialism and enslavement as well. So that's a really important primer for here. Moving past emancipation, we see a lot of movement into the Southwestern Ontario region. So places like Amherstburg, Windsor, Chatham, Dresden, what is now Dresden. And what happens in the Chatham-Kent municipality area is very, very interesting, because you have a mixture of both planned Black settlement, but also just Black movement into the area. So Chatham itself was not a planned settlement by an abolitionist society, but it boasted a very, very dense, by the 1830s, about 1/3 of the population was Black in the city's East End. And then you have places like North Buxton and Dresden that were planned settlements, but even in Dresden, while there was planned settlement, especially by Josiah Henson with his work with William Whipper to establish the Don settlement, there was also Black settlement there that was outside of those settlements. So there were Black folks settling all over the place. Something to keep in mind that is a common misconception about these areas, and this is including Windsor and places in St. Catharines and things like that as well. There is a common misconception that every Black person who came in into Southwestern Ontario from the United States and settled here was a runaway slave.
Right.
That is not accurate. What our community was an amalgamation of free people of color, some of whom had quite a bit of education and money for the time, as well as people who were living free in the United States and were afraid of the 1850s Fugitive Slave Act and ran over here, and also runaway people. So this is a mixture, and that is what contributes, in my opinion, to the success and the flourishment of these communities, is this coming together and mixture of all of these groups. So that's a bit of a primer of these particular communities. And I noticed that you have a question here about whether there were restrictions on settlement moving into Ontario, and the answer is yes.
Right. So
yeah.
So to that as well, I think when we think about the period after the end of slavery in the U.S., a lot of us know about that period of Reconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
Did emancipation in Canada include sort of the concept or any efforts on the part of the government or on the part of society more widely towards integration? And I know, there are certainly histories and stories and experiences of continued segregation after that. So I was wondering about if emancipation was also tied to efforts towards integration. Natasha, if you want to lead with that.
So I'll try to give a succinct response there. I think first we should center it in the Black community and what Black people wanted at the time. And there were, I guess, two camps, if you will. There were those who felt that they should pursue integration into white settler society in Ontario, for example, or in Canada. But there were those who also felt that there should be separate, which is different than segregated, separate communities in order for, freedom seekers, free Blacks, different residents to be able to support each other and grow and thrive together before or if ever to pursue, wider integration into society. So that was a conversation that Black people were having. In terms of government support, there were some. So Deirdre had mentioned there were, anti-slavery societies, church missions that formed. So these are more grassroots based, right? That formed planned communities, which included the selling of land. There was the Lieutenant Governor General who did give some land, such as Coles, Burnsburg, which is in Lucan County, or the Wilberforce community. That was one of the first Black settlements, and then also okayed and gave land to Black settlers in Oro Township or Medante. So there was some of these efforts from the government, but also community based as well. And so this was a conversation as well that that Black people were having into what they should pursue in their best interest for themselves and their children.
So Deirdre, I think sort of expanding from that, can we talk about the North Star and sort of how we might understand Black experience in Canada?
So when I was speaking to you briefly about it, it's actually something that figures very heavily into my own work. And it's something that some of us who are academics of the African Canadian experience refer to as the North Star myth. And if you study the communities that Natasha and I study, you are confronted with this on a regular basis. And basically what the North Star myth is this ideology that Canada presents itself as a nation that is a beacon of freedom. It's a superimposing almost of multicultural policy that did not come around to Canada until the 1980s onto the past. And the reason we refer to it as the North Star myth is because it is very, very heavily rooted in the communities that I specifically study in Southwestern Ontario, those Underground Railroad communities, because the story of the Underground Railroad is used to suggest that, once slaves made the arduous journey to Canada, they were free under the lion's paw referring to the British at the time, because they were a British colony at the time, and that there were no social barriers that these people had to overcome. And that idea stunts scholarship and education of the Black experience in Canada, especially the obsession with comparing ourselves to the United States and trying to use very harsh forms of slavery to juxtapose it next to a very benevolent Canada that never existed. And it really stunts, it doesn't even just stunt the education, it stunts our conversations in this country about race, about belonging, for a multitude of people as well. This doesn't just even affect people of African descent. This affects a lot of different groups of people through us.
So I want to allow our audience just some time to also ask you guys some questions, but I did want to, I suppose, touch on, Dundas Street. Natasha, you raised Baby Point and James Bobby, as well as William Jarvis. And I think maybe sort of the best way to allow you both to expand in the remaining time that we have and bring everything together is ask, what are the consequences of our history, and what does the past that we have mean for our communities today? And also, what's the consequence of our ignorance of our history as well? Natasha.
Well, the past is the present, right? The past is very much with us today, and there are ongoing consequences and legacies of colonization and imperialism. And again, we just look at the conversations and findings over the past few months, right? It's very much with us. And education is important for us to understand that. What does it mean to be on stolen Indigenous land, on unceded Indigenous territory? Or what does it mean to uphold treaties? Where we taught the conversation of unmarked graves of Indigenous children. What does it mean to understand our history of enslavement, and what does that mean for Black people today? So when Black people are agitating for change today, and some people will say, well, if you just work hard, you'll be able to achieve, and all of those kinds of tropes, not understanding the very real ways that the legacies of enslavement, anti-Blackness, and white supremacy play out. I don't know if we're going to get to the question that you'd asked, but one of the questions was, I think I'm paraphrasing it. Will there ever be a time where Black people could
live where they like?
Where they like? No, it will not. I don't see that as something, because it is entrenched in colonization, and it is not just enforced by white supremacist infrastructure and ideas. It's universal, and so other groups also buy into that idea. And so how we interpret space, the value of space, the devaluing of space, is often marked by Black bodies, the presence and the absence of Black bodies. And that is rooted in the history of enslavement. So those are the things that we have to contend with as builders. Exclusivity and primacy of property is often based on the exclusion of Black and other racialized bodies. That is something that remains true. How we contend with our colonial legacy, it will be ongoing, but colonialism is built into our society. So it's not just the names of the streets, it's the names of towns, it's the way things are done, the functioning of the founding and the functioning of government. So we have to take a very close look at how, for example, the naming of Dundas Street is tied to many other things as well. And so I think that renaming, revisiting, contending with that history is important, so that we are then hopefully reimagining something different. And maybe we can get to a place where we can answer that question where, yes, with a yes, where Black people and other groups can live where they like.
Deirdre, Natasha, thank you for joining me for this discussion today. Over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Robert, Natasha, and Deirdre. So many important points were brought forward at this time. We'll be taking some questions from the audience. The first question, I think that we've answered to some of them already. In your expertise, why isn't the history of enslavement taught in Ontario elementary high schools as much as the discussions of the European settlers who discovered this land? Maybe it could be Deirdre. You take that on.
So this is a question that I've asked myself many times, but I think for one, there's a devaluing of the histories of non-Western groups. Our histories are devalued to begin with, and usually our histories are usually only taught in small segments, and it's usually in relation to European groups. So this is partially a problem with the Eurocentric nature of the education system. The other issue is going back to Canada's kind of North Star myth issue that I was talking about earlier, is that Canada has a reluctance to, quite frankly, discuss any issue in their past that is remotely controversial, remotely painful for people. And there's often like a sweeping under the rug, and there's a devaluing of the study of slavery for a couple of reasons. I'm sure Natasha has heard these excuses before. that we don't need to teach Canadian slavery because A, it was not as bad as the Caribbean or the United States, this kind of hierarchy of oppression, therefore it is not worth discussing. There's the excuse that slavery was not as prevalent in Canada because we didn't have like a wide scale plantation system, is another excuse that I've heard from some educators. And then the other excuse is that we don't study slavery, we shouldn't have to study slavery in Canada because it occurred before Canada technically became a country, as if we start Canada at Confederation when we teach students. So those are my actual reasons. And then these are some of the excuses that I've heard from educators who have had pushback against me when I've tried to suggest we do these things.
But that's a picking and choosing, right? And history is a process. And so the narratives that we come to know as history is based on what is presented as historical fact from the archives. So the very same documents that present these glorious biographies and heritage plaques of the founders are the very same documents that I'm going into and locating the people that they enslaved and bequeathed and sold. And so, there's a process, a selective process of deciding what becomes history. And so then just to wrap this question up as well, we also see the ways that history and curriculum play a role in ongoing colonization. There is a particular narrative that is propagated through curriculum and through history about Canadian narratives. And so everyone can know Canada and the Underground Railroad and white benevolence, right? But we don't understand our own history of Black oppression and subjugation through enslavement and racial segregation, for example. We're not as familiar. That's relegated to the United States. So there's a very intentional way that happens, and curriculum plays a role. And so that's why curriculum revisions, revisiting history, reinterpreting history, centering different voices is important. And if we understand our history of colonization more deeply, we will connect all of these things and have a better understanding of our own historical reality.
Okay, with that, we've run out of time, so I just want to bring in Richard Joy for the closing remarks.
Thank you very much.
Richard?
Yes, I'm here, and we are just a little bit over, and I apologize to the audience that we didn't get to all the questions, but as always, we record these questions, and they will inform future programming, and I think there's clearly an interest, high interest in this topic, in understanding this history, and you can expect ULI to come back to it. So thank you all for being part of this. Thank you, Natasha, Deirdre, Robert, and Sean for a really impactful hour, barely touching the surface, but at least giving a foundation for our organization, our industry, to think about what we do as city builders going forward, with lots more in front of us. So with that, I will say good afternoon to all of you, and we'll look forward to seeing you very soon, I hope. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.